In this story, we will try to answer the question, was Empress Elizabeth really crazy, or was her life a real torture? Hello dear friends. If you are here for the first time, welcome. We invite you to subscribe and join our journey through time. And if you have already become our regular viewers, we are grateful for your loyalty and we promise you a new portion of exciting stories. Today we will tell you about one of the most beautiful women in Europe, the legendary Empress Elisabeth of Austria, whose appearance is still considered ideal. However, her life was far from perfect. A series of unfortunate events made many people think that the woman's mind was unstable. What actually happened to Elizabeth? Why did doctors say she was crazy? And how did she go from being a beloved and adored empress to a recluse who avoided people and almost never left the palace? You will find answers to all these questions in today's video, so let's get started. In the sparkling halls of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, she was a vision of beauty and grace, forever enshrined in a legendary painting by Franz Winter. Yet behind the jeweled crown was a woman trapped in a silent prison. They called her Sisi, the most beautiful empress in Europe. But was her life a fairy tale or a slow form of torture? The fairy tale began on Christmas Eve in 1837. 15-year-old Elisabeth of Bavaria arrived in Vienna, not as a bride, but as a pawn in a political game. Her uncle, King Maximilian Joseph of Bavaria, forced her into marriage with Austria's Emperor Franz Joseph, ensuring a Bavarian heir. But was this match a fairy tale or a gilded cage? Sisi and Franz Joseph were attracted to each other at first sight. Their love story seemed like a true fairy tale. However, there was a catch. The young girl was immediately whisked away to a different kingdom. She had to leave her family and move to Vienna, where she would spend the rest of her life. Moreover, she was to live with her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, a formidable woman who ruled over her son and daughter-in-law with an iron fist. Elizabeth loved nature, animals, and freedom, but instead of enjoying these things she had to spend long hours embroidering, playing the piano and having tea parties with other noble ladies whose sole purpose in life was to marry off their daughters and secure their own futures. Despite the fact that the empress gave birth to 4 children, the strict archduchess still saw her as nothing more than a teenager. Elizabeth was forced to follow the same rules as before, which turned her life into a living hell. She was prohibited from reading books without her mother-in-law's permission and even from walking around the palace without an escort. When Elizabeth tried to assert herself and ask for at least some freedom, Sophie ordered her to shut up and listen to what she was told. It got to the point that the archduchess would even reprimand the empress for holding her children too often. As a result, Elizabeth stopped breastfeeding her babies, and the kids were taken away from her. With tears streaming down her face, Elizabeth swore to herself to never forgive her mother-in-law. From that moment on, the relationship between them became so strained that whenever Elizabeth entered the room, Sophie would turn around and leave. Sometimes Elizabeth felt so lonely and misunderstood that she locked herself in her bedroom for whole weeks. To cope with the unbearable situation, she started taking long walks around the palace gardens. However, even there, she was followed by numerous maids and nannies, and the empress could hardly ever enjoy the beauty of nature in peace. Once, while visiting her friend, the Duchess of Modena, Elizabeth learned that her husband was having an affair with another woman. Heartbroken and confused, she went to her mother-in-law for comfort, but the archduchess simply laughed at her and suggested that she reciprocate and find herself a lover. "You must realize," she said, "that as an empress you must bear in mind that your husband can have fun on the side, but you must remain his favorite wife." Since then, Elizabeth realized that if she wanted to survive in that environment, she had to learn how to keep secrets and pretend that everything was fine. From that day on, she always wore elegant dresses, beautiful jewelry and makeup, hiding her emotions and pretending to be happy. It is also worth noting that Elizabeth was one of the first women in Europe who made it fashionable to wear corsets as tight as possible. As a result, her waist became so thin that it attracted the attention of doctors who began to study the empress and call her the ideal of female beauty. Soon, all the fashion designers in Europe were trying to design clothes that would fit perfectly on Elizabeth's slender figure, and she was flattered by such attention. However, despite her apparent contentment, the empress was dying inside. She became a prisoner of the Viennese court, unable to leave the palace and enjoy the world around her. Her strict regime consisted of endless receptions, balls, dinners, and soirees, which left her exhausted and yearning for freedom. Despite her efforts to maintain order and decorum, the rumors persisted, claiming that the empress was losing her mind. But was it really so? To find out the truth, the emperor decided to send his wife to specialists for examination, who after talking with Elizabeth concluded that she suffered from neurasthenia, a psychological disorder that causes chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety, and sometimes even hallucinations. According to the doctors, the Empress needed a long vacation and a change of scenery, and so the Emperor allowed her to travel to Hungary for 3 months with only one condition: she had to return before the summer solstice. But upon arrival in Hungary, Elizabeth found out that she was pregnant again. Seeing no other option, she decided to ignore her doctor's recommendations and stay in Hungary longer. When her son was born, the grateful locals proclaimed her the savior of the nation, since it was rumored that the future heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be born. Elizabeth was so carried away by her new status that she forgot about returning to Vienna altogether. She began traveling around the country, renting entire trains and cars and staying in hotels for weeks. Often she would drive for hours in the open air, enjoying the warm wind and feeling free for the first time in her life. Franz Joseph was furious when he learned about his wife's actions. He demanded that she immediately return to the capital and never set foot outside the palace again. Elizabeth knew that she couldn't win an argument with her husband, so she obediently returned to Vienna. But even there, she continued to defy her husband and mother-in-law. She began to appear in public less and less frequently, hiding her face behind fans and parasols. She was seen wearing the same black dress and veil everywhere, which caused people to start talking and writing articles about the Empress's strange behavior. Her contemporaries claimed that Elizabeth was so obsessed with her appearance that she spent hours applying makeup, choosing outfits and jewelry. But her rooms were often empty and she could easily be mistaken for a ghost. Some claimed that she was driven mad by the constant surveillance and lack of privacy, while others argued that her eccentric behavior was nothing but vanity. In the last years of her life, the Empress became a recluse. She locked herself in her chambers and refused to see anyone, not even her own children. She spent her days reading books, and her nights were filled with nightmares. According to her personal secretary, Baron Ferenczi de Galantha, Elizabeth had become a shadow of her former self. She was terribly thin, pale, and listless, spending most of her time lying on her couch. Her face was devoid of any color, and her eyes stared blankly ahead. The Empress barely ate anything and constantly complained of headaches and pains in her arms and legs. In her chambers, Elizabeth kept a strict routine. Every morning she woke up at 6 a.m. and immediately took a cold shower. After that, she would walk around the room, slowly stretching her arms and legs. Then she would undress and put on a linen nightgown. The Empress spent all day sewing and knitting, refusing to talk to anyone. Only her maid was allowed to enter her room. Elizabeth also strictly followed a diet consisting only of vegetables and fruits, believing that solid food caused her toothaches. Moreover, she completely abandoned her usual perfumes and preferred to smell like fresh air, which she claimed reminded her of her happy childhood. She died in her sleep at the age of 60. We do not know whether the life of the once beautiful Empress Elisabeth of Austria was really a fairy tale or a terrible torture. But one thing is for sure, she was definitely unhappy in her marriage. Unfortunately, this is not the only story of its kind, and now we invite you to share your version of Elizabeth's life story. Write your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see more interesting historical stories, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Take care of yourself and see you soon. Bye.